Hello to everybody once again. I see familiar faces, so it means I don't need to present myself once again. I'm so happy that we are all here together. Today we will talk about institutional models of participatory democratic innovations. And we have three presentations here with us, and one will be unfortunately online. First one was a presentation by Ana Matan and Davor Kavidovic. The second one will be Gilles. Can you help me? Okay. And the third one, Paola Pieri, Hanne Bestenschen, and Max Stearns. I'm sorry if I pronounce it inappropriate. And then we'll have one online presentation by Ines Stasa. So if you are all okay, Anna, we can start with the presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Hello. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here and see all these familiar faces that we haven't seen for such a long time in person. It was also a great privilege to listen to the previous panel with new experiments and attempts to invigorate participatory democracy in the Balkan region, let's say it like that. And my presentation will just go along the same lines. We'll present a practice of participatory budgeting in several towns in Croatia. Some not so very successful and one very successful story, and we can all see then in the discussion what can we all learn from that. It is a project that has been going on for some time, but we're still in a lot of raw data and don't have much systematic conclusions. But I hope you will find it interesting nonetheless. So. Participatory budgeting, as you probably all know, this one doesn't work. Oops, okay. Participatory budgeting, and I saw there's some other presentations on the same topic, is a decision-making mechanism, decision-making process in which citizens themselves decide on the budget, decide where to spend the money that is in the municipal budget, or maybe there are also experiments with the regional budgets or even state level budgets. The practice started in Porto Alegre. It is legendary by now, and as unfortunately it is not practiced there anymore, but it did start there at the end of the 90s, and it has become one of the rare democratic innovations that has traveled from the south to the north, from Latin America to North America, and then to Europe. And in those travels, then the participatory budgeting process did change. The model changed somewhat and has variations. What started as a very leftist, emancipatory model, trying to include less privileged citizens of Porto Alegre into discussing the budget. When it came to Europe, sometimes it turned out to be practiced as a mechanism for reducing budgets and realizing politics of austerity, but also transparency and good government. So the whole process has, let's say, can have different outcomes. What we studied in Croatia, how is the okay now? Can I? Okay, the Croatia has several experiments in participatory budgeting. What we studied was several cities. It started in the early 20s. As you can see, financed and encouraged by the USAID and the Urban Institute. The first big success, and still the biggest success, is the town of Pazin, participatory budgeting there. It is called Pazin Proračun. It was introduced in 2014 for the 2015 budget, and it was financed by one of those EU pre-accession funds. At the same time, another one of those pre-accession funds was also used to introduce participatory budgeting in another 3 towns in Croatia, Karlovac, Pula, and Mali Lošinj, but it was only partially successful. I will talk in a minute about why is that so. And now the Association of Croatian Towns is a big promoter of participatory budgeting. It holds seminars and tries to encourage other city mayors and town mayors to introduce it in their own towns. So it was in the meantime introduced also to Dubrovnik, Trogir, and Makarska. You can see it is mostly being introduced in cities or towns that are on the coast, and that most of them do have a lot of money because they're tourist towns. How our research started, it started and it included several research visits to these towns that have introduced participatory budgeting, and to those that have attempted to introduce it but failed and didn't manage. We made several visits to different towns, and it was a research schedule mainly dependent on the available funding from the University of Zagreb. I will start with presenting the least successful cases or the unsuccessful cases, and then I will go on to the more successful one and try to finish with that and with some discussion what makes for a successful case on 2 levels, on the level of having participatory budgeting survive several participatory budgeting cycles, and on the level of more like evaluating how it contributes to democracy and democratic participation. So the city of the unsuccessful, or let's say the partially successful project, is the one in Mali Lošinj, Karlovac, and Pula. The picture here is just to keep you awake. It is it's a statue of Approxiomen in Mali Lošinj, and what we saw there, why the participatory budgeting didn't happen or didn't go as planned. There was a famous lack of political will in all 3 towns, and what we saw in the interview. The interviews were held like this year, and then looking back, the actors admitted that in trying to implement the project, they did have somewhat contestatory, like adversarial relationship with the city officials. It was a project that was led by civil society organizations that were very activist, very eager to implement the project, but in doing so, what they admitted was they didn't find what they say a common language with the city officials or town officials. On the other hand, the town officials also were not very eager to own the participatory process, so that was like a mismatch. Another, let's say, negative or less positive thing that didn't go well in this case was the model that was used. And since this is a panel on institutional mechanisms and institutions, this is maybe the most important thing. The model that they tried to introduce was an online platform where citizens would be presenting different proposals, and then like in other platforms, there would be kind of vote by likes and comments, and the project that would get most likes and comments would be considered the one that should be presented to the local government and should be suggested to be realized. And all this went through, and it happened, and people did propose projects, and people did participate somewhat, but in the end, almost none of the proposed projects was realized except one small project in the town of Mali Loši. It was a street workout thing that was built, and people kind of like it and still like it from what we saw in our visit to Mali Loši. It didn't continue. So as long as the EU project was on, the process was going on. And after, when the project finished, the platforms died out and no further propositions or proposals or participation happened on them. Similar unfortunate destiny was in the city of Dubrovnik, which is very unfortunate and very disappointing because the city of Dubrovnik is a very rich city, as you can imagine. And it started as a huge, grandiose promise of the mayor of Dubrovnik that will assign 1 million kuna. I was trying to calculate, it's more than 100,000 euros to each of the sub-local units in Dubrovnik, to the sub-municipal units, the so-called neighborhood councils. But unfortunately, Corona came and the thing didn't go through. It just died out. The mayor went to earn his second mandate and wasn't very interested anymore. He was much more interested in participatory budgeting during his previous mandate, as other mayors that we kind of found out that the executive branch or the executive part of decision makers is very keen, very eager to introduce participatory budgeting when they're new to power or when they're trying to get into power, because they want to have something new, something to, attract their voters with. And then if the project doesn't stay, then they lose interest. So it didn't. The Dubrovnik project also failed. But fortunately, we do have one success story, and that's the Pazin case. And this is, as you can see on the picture, the Department of Finances, the City Department of Finances, the head of the City Department of Finances, Maja Stanić-Grah, and it is one of those citizens' neighborhoods where she presented the budget. The model is very important, I think, and I think it's a big part of the success of the Pazin participatory budgeting. It is based, I found it in the literature that it's called Porto Alegre Adapted to Europe model. It is based on assigning a certain amount of money to sub-local units and then letting the people in those units decide how do they want to spend that money. It starts with a call from the local government to all citizens to make their proposals. They can make the proposals online, in form of email, in written form, just come to the city and explain what they want. Then the city government makes a budget for the proposals. And if the budget is within the assigned amount of money for each sub-local unit, then it is considered, let's say, legitimate. All of the proposals are then presented at each and every sub-local unit. It's a big event. The mayor and the heads of departments, or maybe only the heads of departments, depending on the year, they go to each and every sub-local unit and they present all the proposals that have come to the city from that sub-local unit with pictures. It is very professionally done. I can say we participated this year to this event. And then the citizens who have come to this event are asked to vote and decide which of the proposals will be realized. And the final phase of this model is realization of the model, of the proposal, of the citizens' proposal. And I don't think there were any exceptions, but maybe there have been some minor exceptions, but I think everything that has been voted on has been realized within the year when the thing was voted to be realized, which gives a lot of how to say, a lot of energy, fuel into the project, and everybody is happy. Although, as you can see, it is a very small amount of money. It's not much money, but still, you know, like it is the amount that people know it's theirs, and it can be spent in whichever way they want, according to the law, of course. Okay, so. Okay, I'm not in a pressure. I don't have time. Okay, I'll hurry up. Okay, so I will just try to hurry up. I think I already said most of this. As I said, the citizens, the city government, and both in the political part of the city government and in the let's say administrative part of the city government have owned the project. It survived change in power, and I don't see that this project is going to go anywhere. It's going to. My understanding is that it will stay. It will stay in the city. So I termed it a political success. And the reasons for this success, as I mentioned, is a well-chosen model and very well adapted to the specificity of the Pazin as a town, because as I said, it is based on the sublocal units, and these sublocal units match, let's say, organic community in the city of Pazin. I know Pazin has like 15 churches, so you can imagine that all of these communities go back very long time, and then it is very, you know, it was very adaptive to that situation. But on the other hand, as I said, the downside is that these little communities have their own leaders, and this process just kind of merges in terms of power with the present distribution of power. So mostly men, middle-aged men participate, as you can see in the picture. Although I've been told that they do what their wives tell them at home. So that's a silver lining of this thing. And this is just a few words how I see, how can we evaluate this, what I think is a political success, how can we evaluate in terms of democratic innovations and democratic participation. In terms of equality, as I said, the usual suspects participate. You can also see on this picture, these are like pictures from those meetings. Mostly, as I said, men, not many young people, although now that almost 10 years into the project, there some changes can be seen. So I think somebody said today this morning, like if you go with it long enough, then you can expect some evolution and people getting confidence in the process, and more people getting involved and participating. So far, we didn't find any positive correlation with conventional participation, so no greater turnout in any level of elections, except just for one cycle for those sub-local elections. For example, this is one of the sub-local units. It's called Heki. Heki has 7 city or sub-local councillors, neighborhood councillors, to be elected. And 1 year before the participatory budgeting process, there was a turnout of 6 people in these elections. So not even those who were candidates for the council showed up to vote. And this was a big improvement, obviously, that at least more people voted, more than 6 in those elections. There is a tendency of the deliberation to a communication to be only between the people from the city and the public or the citizens, not so many among the citizens, but that that changes, I guess, from year to year, depending whether there is a professional moderator or not. And in terms of political efficacy, I think I've mentioned that if we understand political efficacy as realization of agreed policy, I think it's like 100% efficacious, but in that tiny little sphere of very small amount of money spent on very small things. So like that is like realized, but what are the bigger effects of that we can discuss. And it also breeds high level of transparency of the process of creating the budget and spending the budget. And since I did my time, I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. This is very interesting. I will now go, although I thought that, now we will talk about participatory budgeting at supranational level in France. So it's, yeah.
The keyboard, yeah. Hello, everyone. So thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be in Belgrade for the first time. So my PhD is about the extension, well, the replication of participatory budgeting at the state level in Brazil. But here I will just present.
Sorry for that.
I'm in the line of the camera. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
And I put the microphone as well. Okay, so I will present today about the French cases that are not at the city level, but that are the supra-municipal level. And I hope you will bear with me the sound of music. I will try to keep in with the pace, but I'm not sure I will manage to do so. My main framework is about policy diffusion, so I'm trying to understand how it's being replicated. And they're getting closer to the window every minute, so. But no, I'm fine. So basically, I will try to show you how they work and how limited they are. I think you will follow up on some questions about the teeny space that Anna was talking about.
I think you need to...
No. I need, but the keyboard is not. It's online, but it's not. Maybe I should come closer. Maybe I will use that. Mine is like a. Yeah, should work. It works. Okay. Sorry about that. So I used first, before looking at how they work, map all the processes that we had in France, first at the city level, and for this presentation, I tried to update, and that's why I didn't send the presentation as well. The paper is, I tried to update with the last results about what's going on for this year. So I conducted a couple, like 10 interviews with staff departments, and also I trying to analyze the kind of the type of projects that are being selected, and I will talk about that a little bit later. But this is still under analysis. So I look at first in France now for the processes that are at the department level, so at the supra-municipal level, they are all online based. Most of them don't imply any face-to-face meetings. There is only one case where actually they try to make a process where some sortition were used in order to gather young people in order to analyze the different proposals before the voting phase. I will talk about that later. But basically, I look at the different functionalities of websites. And yeah, well, so we already have the explanation of what is PB, what is not. Still a lot of literature about PB at the national level, international level. We do have some goals that varies across countries and across experiences. So sometimes transparency is a goal that is very important. I think in Europe, and I will actually explain why in France it's not the case. For example, legitimacy is a great driver for the diffusion of participatory budgeting. Responsiveness, we don't have like special criteria for that, but I believe it's not really effective. Empowerment, very little. Politicization, depends. And social justice, well, most cases in France are not related to social justice at all. So you see from when you analyze the rules, at the beginning of the rules, there are always the objectives, and sometimes it's very vague principles, but most of the time those principles do not fit with those CS goals you see here and that are broadly illustrated by the literature. So we do have like different waves of PB in France. It started, of course, the link with Brazil was made with the World Social Forum. We had like a couple of experiments linked to the Communist Party in France. That was the first wave. The second wave was linked to what was implemented in high schools, actually with a lot of budgets. And it was a very interesting experiments where facilitators were engaged within schools in order to facilitate discussions. Now it's also over. And for the last election and the election before, in 2014, we had a new trend of creating PB. You had to do PB in your city if you wanted to be innovative, whatever innovation means, of course. And what is interesting in the case of the département, so the supramunicipal level, is Paris is both a city and a department, like in many, well, France is not federal at all, but in many federal countries, the federal district is both a city and a state or a federal entity. And what is interesting is like the second department that started to do that is not connected to Paris at all. So basically, many cities try to copy Paris, but for the departments, we didn't have any experiments between 2014 and 2018, unless a very rural department, Le Gers, where you could actually create, do foie gras. That's the main department where foie gras is made. And this is very uncommon for both policy diffusion and democratic innovations, because we don't expect a rural area, a rural territory to start an innovation and then to become the main leader and being followed by many examples. You could expect that from a city capital city, but not from a very rural area that was not really connected in policy networks as well. So this is very uncommon, and that's why I thought it was interesting. Yeah, we'll cover that. So basically, we do like a lot of clusters in that case of department that are in the south and in the north and in the south. But that's few facts. This is the worst slide ever, but sorry about that. We do have like 26 cases of PB at the supramunicipal level. Basically, it's like a fourth of our local authorities at that level. What is interesting is also a significant part started after the main city of the department started. So there is like a bottom-up diffusion process. So started at the city level within the area, and then because the city did it, the main city did it, then the upper level tried to implement actually with the same format without much innovation. So there is if we try to analyze like regional influences, there is like the influence of neighbors, but also the influence of the level that is below. We do have like some of them are trying to focus on specific issues like youth issues or sustainable department or sustainable development. Sorry, the budget is very low. I will show you exactly what it means for the French context, and we also have, in some cases, something that doesn't exist for the city level is that they cap the number of winners on the different districts within the department in order to maximize spatial equity, let's say. The only good thing I could say about French PB at that level is basically it's a way to experiment different ways of voting. So preferential voting, for example, or well, in the French system for the normal elections, the traditional elections, you only vote for one candidate. In that case, in France, you could, for the French PB, you could actually use different rules to select the proposals. So what is very uncommon, so I mentioned that most cases are actually implemented in departments with low density of population, which is very uncommon, again, so not only for the one that started the wave, but also for the implementers, that's very uncommon. And something that is not uncommon that we could expect from the literature is like based and implemented mostly by leftist governments. Doesn't mean they start a revolution, but it's still expected. So when we look at what it means for the budget, basically the number of budget per habitant is very low, as you could see. And when we look at the proportion of the budget from the overall budget that is really dedicated to PB is marginal, if not ridiculous. And I believe you didn't provide data for Croatia, but that's why in some cases, I wonder if we really have to mention a link with Porto Alegre where this was supposedly all the investment that were decided through PB. In that case, that's not the case. But this is not the investment budget. This is the overall budget, but usually it's about 5% of the investment budget. This is the common rule in France now for French PB. And of course, when you don't decide about something that really is relevant for people, like, well, with COVID, we talk about hospitals, but in French PB, you cannot create any hospitals. You cannot create any public transport through PB. So, yeah, marginal. The second point I want to mention about the cases that we see in France is a very low level of deliberation. There's only one case that I mentioned briefly. This is Val-de-Marne near Paris, where they had like a discussion for 2 days in order to analyze the proposals, in order to see if they were really fit into the criteria, the technical criteria of feasibility analysis, but mostly they don't do that. And when they have some kind of deliberation, it's a very small body that is an advisory council with some people that are selected or co-opted. And that doesn't have a lot of power. They are just trying to see if the rules are followed, but actually if the rules are not followed, they cannot do anything. So what we could see also based on the analysis of what we find on the platforms, on those digital platforms that are supposedly to help people to engage and to connect and to participate at whenever they want. If it's in the evening or early in the morning, they could reach the platform and connect and submit proposals or comments. And when we look at the comments, most comments are, well, first, in many occasions, the platform doesn't allow for commenting. When they do, you see that the proposals are very low. So if it's 110 comments, but actually you have much more comments, much more proposals. So basically when you divide, actually most proposals don't get any comment whatsoever. And when we look at the quality of the comments, which is something that in deliberative democracy, you look at the quality of the argumentation. Most arguments are, I like your project is awesome, without any discussion of the merits or how to improve proposals, the link between different proposals that could compete, whereas they are actually on the same topic. So there is not a lot of negotiation happening on those platforms. So that's the point about low deliberation. And I still have like 6 minutes. The third point I want to mention that is more and more discussed in political science is the cherry picking effect. So basically, we will have a lot of presentations about citizen assembly. For example, we have the same problem for PB, but it doesn't happen at the same time. You mentioned for Croatia that in PASIN that most proposals were implemented. What I find in the French cases is actually most proposals are ejected before the vote, the voting phase. So that could have an impact on how many proposals are really implemented at the end. But when we look at the table, so yeah, let me check. Yeah, basically what happens when you have a proposal, you have this technical analysis. And then sometimes it could be rejected. If you're lucky, it would be with a justification. In some cases, you don't have any justification of why your proposal is not going through the voting phase. Sometimes there is a process of what I call informal evaporation. It's when you are merging different proposals, but instead of additioning the costs, they are merging the costs. So basically, you could have like, if you have like a project about one place and they are merging 3 projects in 3 different places, it will be the same price. So basically, you cannot divide the cost of a bench. Well, bench is an easy example, but think about, I don't know, trees. So you will have like 1 tree in one place and well, it's ridiculous. And then if you're really lucky, your proposal will be approved for the voting phase. And when we look at how it works for the different departments, so for example, in the case of Paris, for example, that is supposed to be a success, a third of the proposals are selected and are accepted to go to the voting phase. So it means 2/3 of those proposals are not even going to reach the voting phase. And when you look at, so how many are going to the voting phase and then how many winners, you see that actually some are very, some processes are very selective, while Loiret, for example, if you are going to the voting phase, actually you are very, it's very likely that your proposal will be selected. And again, and here, what is missing from this presentation is like, what are those winning proposals? And in this teeny space, as you mentioned, I like the expression, most projects won't have a social impact. Again, we are not building new public services or new public policies based on that. It's like this famous example that you have and we find everywhere, the street workout. I mean, that's great, but, and we find the same thing for the point I'm going through, so I'm not presenting here, but it's all the projects that are linked to sustainability. You will find the beehive. Beehives are really bad for biodiversity, but in France, we see beehives for like everywhere now, funded through PB. Like, it's not about creating new parks or no, you just have like a beehive and it's fine. Again, so the last point is the link with a broader strategy towards open government. And I look at all those departments that are trying to implement or just follow what is by law compulsory regarding open data, regarding financial data. And actually, most PB, most local authorities that implement PB are not doing what they should do by law regarding public procurements, for example, or the data about NGO funding, for example. So there is like a very interesting contrast about what kind of transparency you are trying to bring with participatory budgeting. And at the same time, actually, you don't, and it's only about information. It's not about participating in the project, but you don't provide essential critical data about how your finance work in your local authority. So, and I'm not even talking about taxes that are raised and so on. But basically, a total separation between the department that are launching PB and the ones that are trending about open budget. So yeah, I'm trying yeah, actually, no, I need to. So basically what we find, the main differences between the first waves, and I wouldn't call that innovations, but first waves of adaptation of PB in France and what we find now, basically there are less obscure rules. Now we have clear regulations. There is more space for citizens in the way of being in the process. Before it was really top down, and actually citizens were not even the advisory board, but still you have a very high level of cherry picking, and the impacts of those projects are quite limited, which is something I'm not really showing in the presentation, but I'm still working it. And basically it's what we call now in urbanism, this kind of projects linked to urban architecture. So it really depends on if you believe in architecture or not. Conclusion. So still, this is an early presentation about how vertical diffusion of bottom-up diffusion could work in the case of political innovations. We don't have in France any national injunction, so we don't have any national law in order to force local authorities to implement PB, so it's just on a voluntary basis. Still, we need maybe to shift our research agenda towards the question of co-optation that supposedly in Brazil, most PB processes were engaged because citizens and civil society organizations were able to challenge the mayor and the administration about what is being implemented and of course what is not being implemented. In that case, in France, this is not really studied at the moment, but I guess there is still a lot of corruption, especially in the groups that are selected in the advisory board. Then, and of course, and that's something that I need to find out now, is like what kind of projects are really selected, and in the cherry picking, how you cherry pick projects. Is it like only based on technical data, technical criteria, or is like other criteria that are not technical at all? And then the last question is more linked to what kind of frustration could be built through this way of adapting PB. And I know that in this conference, a lot of discussion will be about hybrid democracies, but actually there is a very interesting article published by Fernandez Martinez 2 years ago, talking about also participatory frustration in Spain. So this frustration is not only linked to the broader political system, but basically for many reasons, you could leave a process, PB if the French, for example, the French Citizen Assembly about climate change, I think most participants were really disappointed with the process. That doesn't imply that they will not be engaged in politics no anymore, but there will be no trust with Macron's government. So that's something else. So how you build a movement based on that, that's something we will see. But yeah, basically democratic innovations are not enough per se in order to start a revolution, exactly, consider democracy. And actually, if we think about Porto Alegre, they started this because they were really much inspired by Soviets, Soviet or the Commune Revolution in Paris. So it was a way of starting the revolution and to challenge the local municipal assembly. It was not creating streets workout projects, which, yeah, not a good conclusion, sorry.
Thank you very much. This is very interesting. We'll go back to the questions later. Now we will go to the next presentation. Paola and Hannah are here with us. So. I think now it's working. Oops, sorry. So, good morning, everyone. I mean, you're moving. Okay. And then we can talk. I can talk here. No? Okay. And I mean, in the time that we get the presentation on, thanks for inviting us. And really good to be here with you this morning. I think our talk is going to be a little bit different, and we wanted to actually use this opportunity to share a little bit of like our thinking, hopefully responding to some of the issues that have been raised already this morning, like how can we go to a very punctual, eventful moment of democracy into something that has a bit more of a long-term space. We're going to do the talk, me and my colleague Hannah, so the two of us, but somebody else also helped in writing the paper that you might have seen and received. So in the next 20 minutes or so, we're gonna talk through these 4 points. I'm gonna start with a brief introduction about the organization, where we're coming from. And then I'm gonna tell you a little bit more about this idea of infrastructure and what does it mean for experiments from our point of view, looking at the literature on the topic. And then I'm gonna pass it over to Hannah, who is gonna talk you through actually very briefly, but three case studies, an example that speaks to our idea of what we call democratic infrastructures. And we're gonna finish with some preliminary conclusions. As I said before, it's very much sharing work in progress, so thinking in progress. So very welcome any feedback or comments that you might have. So very quickly on the introduction and a little bit about ourselves. So we're both from this organization called Democratic Society, who is based in Brussels and has been working to advance democratic principles and knowledge for more than 10 years. What I think is really interesting of the work of Democratic Society is actually that it's one of the very few organizations that does democratic practice. So we help organizing a lot of citizen assembly, we design, facilitate those type of processes. We've been designing and supporting governments in running many participatory budgeting processes, for instance, across Europe. But it's one of the few organizations that has also developed a research agenda, which I think is really interesting in this field, because we see what the research could do in our organization as being like two sides. So on one hand is making sure that when we design those citizen assemblies, we are actually informed by the literature on the topic of what others have learned, but also that we can use the empirical work, which is a little bit more what we're sharing today, to actually advance possibly gap in knowledge, or showing and demonstrating or reflecting together with other practitioners on what does it mean to do the democracy differently. So there's this double angle. The organization, as I said before, is based in Brussels, but we very much work according to this principle of like being grounded in politics, being something that happens locally. And therefore, everywhere we work, we have at least one person or more per people involved, depending on the size of the work, which of course can speak the language, which for us is fundamental. Politics is done in specific languages, but also can understand the cultural context of where we go and work to advance democracy. So just to contextualize, that was, I hope, a little bit useful, because it's a slightly different presentation and it's not from an academic actor.
What we want to bring to the session today is this thinking about experiments and experimentation. So not talking about democratic innovation, but talking about experiments with and for democracy. And this is a field, of course, where several scholars have been writing and working before, which have been looking at different possibilities and modes for experimenting with democracy. And some have been focusing on the role of social movements. They've been mentioned already before in advancing democratic experiments, which are pushed by a large group of collectives that are asking for changes to be made. Others have been highlighting how much experiments, most of the time actually happens in urban context, arguably, but that was very much literature coming from climate change and urban and geography scholars who are actually looking at why in urban context, there are all the conditions to allow cities to start experimenting with innovative governance model for transition, for instance. But there's also others who are looking at creativity in politics or creativity for democracy and more creative methods to design democratic experiments. So just a quick note, which we also shared in the paper, when we talk about experiments, we're not talking about them in the scientific mode. We very much draw on the work of John Dewey, who was talking about experiments as a method of democracy. And therefore, we look at actually proposals that and policies that are subject to revision, things that are not fixed, that can be tried out, that can be experimented with, but of course with the caveat that it's absolutely important to keep up the constant process of observing the results of those experiments and putting them into questions if they don't work. So it is a mode of being rather than an outcome. This is an experiment. This is very much an attitude and an approach that we need to take in democracy. What we suggest in the paper and the presentation today and what we've been doing in our work is actually thinking about literature on infrastructure and try to understand what can we learn from that literature in other fields to learn about how to make more democratic experiments. So the idea is that this idea of like experiments that can have a long-term impact, but also an infrastructure that can allow the conditions for experimenting more. What we've been doing is basically like looking at a copious literature on infrastructure that comes from all other fields of studies and possibly filling a gap, because this literature, to our knowledge, has not been put in conversation with democratic theory and democratic scholarship. So we've been looking into urban studies, geography, design, and science and technology to understand how infrastructure is understood, what are the properties, what it is, how it works. And then we're trying to think with those concepts and see what does that do for democracy. So very briefly, what I'm doing, and then I'm passing over to my colleague, is like just giving you a little bit of like a definition or some sense of like a very quick walk through how this concept of infrastructure, which is quite complex and full of nuances, is actually being used in the literature. The very much like first idea that we have in mind is when we talk about or think about infrastructure, is this idea of assemblages of different things. It's pipes, it's train lines, but it's also servers or information that are used to connect and transport people, signals, information, or materials. These things usually are, have a property. They sit in the background of our everyday life. We don't always see them. Some we do, train lines. Some we don't, information infrastructure. And very much we are taken for granted. We very much assume that these infrastructures are going to work, and they are there, in fact, and they allow us to actually go about with our lives by being present. What we think is that actually infrastructure should be understood much more, and a lot of the literature points in that direction, as a social cultural concept. Infrastructure is not just things and material, but it's very much semantic, and is very much full of meanings that are in fact the circulator of the infrastructure, and are also like recombined by the different actors that use the infrastructure. And also in the literature, again, trying to learn from other disciplines, we learned that these infrastructures are increasingly realized and considered as not being neutral, but being extremely political, because politics and power, as we learn from Foucault and others, is also like, can be considered an infrastructure in itself. One thing that we clearly like, we clearly be looking at in understanding our understanding of infrastructure is that for us it's not a fixed thing. Sometimes infrastructure can be understood or imagined as something that is staying and is allowing, actually like a platform. So it's allowing actors to come to the infrastructure and take the resources or the things that they need. For us, that's not the definition of infrastructure that we think it could be useful to adopt within democratic theory and practice, because actually infrastructures are, as Karastia says, very much generative. They do create new meaning and they do allow for variation. So therefore, we would argue like they do allow for experimentation. They are conducive to those conditions that allow for long-term, so rooting, grounding experiments, but also allow the conditions for more experiments to be made. And this is the last point, again, from theory that I wanted to bring, which is this idea that infrastructure is a thing, the pipeline, the server, the information, but it's also a process. And we found that also really interesting when we think about infrastructures in democracy, where infrastructure is therefore not the end point, is not what we're aiming to achieve, like in the definition of experiments that I was briefly mentioning before, but it's very much a process. There's also been in the literature that I'm reporting here, that it's been very much also used to form publics, again, in the Deweyan sense of the word, so to get people attention and people interest and people feeling of like belonging and participation around different issues. And I think in the next session, we're going to bring these things a little bit more to life in terms of like how we're using it and using this concept from the theory of infrastructure to talk about democracy.
Hi, I will reflect a bit on what this concept of democratic infrastructure means for our practice. And I start with the ambition. With this idea of democratic infrastructure, we want to ensure participatory democratic processes that embrace the long term, and the long term is really the key principle here. Paula already mentioned it, and we will see it in the further presentation, but in the sense that it allows democracy to be enacted beyond these single events, but even beyond these processes. And to provide the resources, the skills, and the attitudes that are needed. And when we started this first thinking, we came up already with 3 elements that are critical for us to this concept of democratic infrastructure. And I go over them now, and I'll try to have an example from our practice for each of them, where we think we were able to do this kind of infrastructuring, or to be able to embed some of these elements in our group. And the first, as already mentioned, is that long-term vision and moving away from project-based and ad hoc approach. And it was already in the sense this morning, and we talked about more standing assemblies and so on, so that I think that thinking is like a trend all over the field. Thinking about what remains beyond the project goals, what other goals do we have beyond the immediate project goals. And for us, it's the building or the scaffolding, these essentially flexible structures. And I want to stress this flexible part, because it's kind of different than the standing assembly, although that is long-term too. With creating this infrastructure, we want governments and organizations to be able to also address different challenges, to resource them for different challenges that might come up with in the future, although these are different from the previous one. And one example where we were able to implement that long-term vision is with Vooruit. And Vooruit is like the Social Democrat Belgian political party. And they have a new president, and they wanted to have that internal democratization process that we see in France and all over. Political parties want to become more of a movement and less of a political party. And they wanted to engage with also citizens that weren't members, like the broad audience. And they came to us wanting a participation process towards their election program. So their question was to gather input from citizens for their election program. But in co-design sessions with them, we were able to reframe that question so that we built for democratic structures that didn't have an ending in this election program. We introduced that we worked with the broad audience on specific challenges with a combination of methods of ideation and deliberative panels with citizens and ministers and others. So that this democratic exercise or experiments could live longer than their initial framework of the election program. And they could keep addressing these different challenges together with citizens and a broad audience. So we're implementing these structures now that can be used by the political party for the longer term than just the following elections. The next element that is important for this democratic infrastructure is capacity building and cultural change. And those are two different elements, but they can easily reinforce each other. When there is more capacity and people have more knowledge and skills, it makes it easier to have this cultural change and to look at different challenges in a government or in an organization with that different lens, that essentially democratic lens. And what is important here is that often first experiments are just that capacity building is done just within the participation department or the democracy department. But if you are able to include a whole government or a whole organization, that's when you can really make that change. It's easier to work on those skills, on those knowledge, on those capacity, and it's easier to transform that into this cultural change. And one example, and I don't have to introduce PB anymore after the previous presentations, but we work in Vienna on a climate PB. Only for climate proposals and with a serious amount of money. But in Vienna, they understood from the beginning that this wasn't just a PB process. From the beginning, their goal was this process to be an enabler for more democratic innovation and just climate action for the long term. So using this project as like the first step towards a bigger goal. Here we see that long-term vision again. And they understood that governance innovation was critical because they faced some silo thinking that wasn't adapted to face these huge climate questions in the city. And they used this PB example as the first step of this government innovation. Different departments in the city working closely together and working closely with us and other experts on democratic innovation to work on that capacity building, to work on those skills, and therefore to really start that cultural change. And when all of the departments are used to come up with these democratic experiments, they're more willing to do that. They're more willing to involve others, and they're more willing to undertake those experiments. And those experiments contribute to the capacity building. So they can really reinforce each other in like a positive spiral or something. And the last element we came up with are networks. And networks for us are intentional long-term relationships that are formed within, but also outside an organization or government. Those networks are an ideal space for experimentation, as if they are based on trust. If you manage to have some trust, there can really be some experiments. And if you also organize your learning, what you learn from these experiments within those networks will be able to address all those different challenges that you face in the future, also again for the long term. The last example is the Life Pact project, and it's a project of nature-based solutions that we're doing in 3 cities in Europe, in Leuven, in Madrid, and in Krakow. And it has a huge replication element in these processes. So we start in one city, in Leuven, and we try to replicate both within the city, but also over the different cities, the engagement strategies in neighborhoods and in anchor in institutions, to see what engagement strategies really work to work with nature-based solutions. And what we were able to implement here is this creation of the participation hub. That is a core network, and the goals are to trigger action and experiments, but also to share learning and resources and to build relationships. And it is a core team of people who are really involved, like the owners of those anchor institutions and the city and so on, but also a looser involvement of more unexpected allies like activists and artists and grassroots or organizations. And we experiment with this hub, with this network in this project, but also our aim is that this network, when built on trust, can not only address the specific issue of nature-based solutions, but also collect and build on every knowledge that is in the network around other engagement strategies, and can be used for all other challenges to address them in a democratic way in the future. So also here it's the creation of the network, and the goal is that it lasts even after this initial project is gone. So to conclude, we use this term of democratic infrastructures to revitalize democracies. And when we move from ad hoc project-based interventions towards this democratic infrastructures, we allow for avoiding the democratic shortcuts that where participation processes are often used as this kind of quick fix. We take the time to address the root causes of the problems of the democracy. There is time to take care of the structural inequalities. And one critique that is often heard, and that we also saw this morning, is that with some of these processes, we empower the few, but also how can we empower the many? And by building on this infrastructure and create this democratic culture, we have more opportunities to address this critique in the long term. And then we end with a first go at what we see as a definition of these democratic infrastructures, and we might enrich it in the future. But our first attempt is like a complex of elements that can be used flexibly and enable, nurture, and reinforce and reimagine democratic processes. And Paola also mentioned that we also want to use this as a process or as a verb, the process of infrastructuring. And that is the intentional creation of these elements in a certain context. And what we do in our practice is looking at what is the initial question, what is the project that we are working on, and how can we, by doing a certain project or by doing a certain process, create something that lasts for the longer term.
Okay. Thank you very much. Very much. This was very interesting. Now we have one online. Yeah, everything is ready, I suppose. Yeah.
Hello. Do you hear me? Hello. Hello. Do you hear me?
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes, it's better.
Okay, so that was the fault of headsets. Thank you very much for inviting me, for accepting my abstract. Unfortunately, I couldn't manage to be in Belgrade, even though I know that it's a very wonderful city. I visited last week and I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you. It's a very pleasant experience to be in your conference and to talk about deliberative democracy in Albania, even though it is a very less developed topic here. And I'm going to say a few words on this. So deliberative democracy might be a kind of a puzzle that post-communist countries in the Western Balkans should approach to correct and spell out the alternatives gone bad with a transitioning path to democracy. In several years, international reports and indexes have rated these countries as hybrid regimes or flawed democracies, reporting political features of autocracy, low levels of civic engagement in decision-making, and low levels of participation in electoral processes. Thus, deliberative democracy might be an opportunity not yet explored in the hands of citizens and groups of interests in order to level up the engagement and their interests in the central or local government decision-making. This article or this presentation today seeks to analyze the first social experiment conducted in Albania in November 2021 with 110 randomly selected participants from a sample of 1,200 pre-surveyed citizens. Issues that were deliberated in 4 days, an experiment conducted by a think tank in Albania. So issues that were deliberated in 4 days were mainly focused on parliamentary oversight, internal political party democracy, electoral system reform, environmental protection, and economic immigration. A national survey of 1,200 study participants were conducted by Institute for Democracy and Mediation in Albania, whose findings this article aimed to interpret and deliberate for recommendations. But first of all, in the first part of this paper, I will outline some features or talk about the state of democracy in Albania, because this is highly important to understand why deliberative democracy in Albania is under-researched and less developed, I think, within the countries in the Western Balkans. So far as I heard and followed during the presentations of this day. So with the first part, I will briefly introduce you with the state of democracy in Albania and the levels of trust in governance. And then I will talk about the national consultation conducted by the Prime Minister office here in Albania a few months ago, which was highly contested within the society here, and because it was seen as attempts by the Prime Minister office here for risks of populism and rational ignorance of the public. And then I will briefly say some key findings about the deliberative poll of Institute for Democracy and Mediation in Albania. So first of all, we will talk about the state of democracy here. And I have taken as a main pillar of this analysis the state building process in Albania, which is very linked with the transitioning period and then with the state of democracy. So with the regime change in Albania, as you know, Albania has been one of the most isolated countries during the communism. So with the regime change in Albania, one of the main concerns was the upcoming constitutional and institutional design of the post-communist and the democratic state to be. So the transition reflected over the 30 years since the replacement of the regime, the very contested and deviated path towards democracy and sustainability of political, social, and economic development. This article seeks to bring at the forefront the inadequate approach, the lack of a proper model that will generate conceptions of political and moral responsibility, legitimacy, and collective forces for state building, the ones that were missed throughout transitional politics in Albania. Albania remains one of the less researched post-communist countries in the Eastern Europe and in the Western Balkans region. The difference of Albania and post-former Federation of Yugoslavia countries is still persistent in the regional politics and/or in international intervention in state-building projects. In contrast to other countries in the region, Albania is the one and the only that did not have the pressure of nation building instead of that of a state building. Even though Albanian leadership, political discourse, and the tendency to protagonize have been more dominant in the last 10 years, Albania had to deal only with the state building process. And the very real homework to be done by Albanian political actors was to create the environment wherein the state would lie and build economic, social, political infrastructure, wherein the whole society would express and represent its common interests. What has gone wrong with the Albanian transition may be the main question that arises today at most of the segments of population, experts, and transition scholars. One of the prominent scholars here in Albania, Ilir Kalema, in 2020, has screened the early moments of Albanian transition in terms of rapid economic reforms, lack of political consensus for major national issues, legacy of lack of political culture, and among many other concerns, the way politics operated and still operates behind the wings. Moreover, what was to be done first and foremost in the early stages after the fall of the communism as to conduct a prompt process of breaking with the past and its institutional legacy, and of importance to shed light in this kind of analysis is to figure out the nature of state during communism and what did it mark in terms of institutions, under what political and social conditions would the new institutions be built in order to fulfill the duty. So this scholar highlights the fact that the lack of consolidated civil society and the social withdrawing of the public from key issues have turned transition in a natural or normal way of operating and living. Another concern, which is very linked with the deliberative democracy elements and the lack of it here in Albania, is the continuing legalization of politics, wherein the executive branch holds the largest number of law proposals in the parliament, rather than increasing participation of political community in the public topics, and the nature of technocracy, the domestic issues have been interpreted and advanced. This has led to the decrease of trust of public in government and stagnation of legitimacy of political leadership. Among other post-communism scholars like Milica Valic in 2012 pays attention to the context of the Western Balkan countries after the 1989, reflecting of the wounds of dissolution of the Yugoslav Federation and all the consequences that followed after that. Albania is considered as one of the early reform-oriented countries due to the fast speed of economic reforms taken in the name of shock therapy. The question that should be raised here is whether the fast speed of those early reforms hindered the process of state building and prolonged the state of democracy in a post-communist country, which has fully been isolated for 4 decades. Moreover, the rapid economic programs, in concert with the political and institutional infrastructure of dictatorship, combined with a lack of elite competition, massive immigration, lack of dissidence, and grassroots movements, have motivated the highly political divisiveness among social groups and contributing to a lack of cohesion and reconciliation after the civil war history in 1943, followed by the class struggle during communism. So primarily, we should understand what kind of state are we inheriting and what are we supposed to put efforts on building. In the Albanian case, the inheritance was the harsh communist legacy with personalistic dictatorship leadership style. Another scholar, Grizumala, defines Albania as a personalistic state-building process where people are not able to break through the system without some level of compliance. Thus, the process of state building is hindered by the existing ties of patronage and clientelism, which were enhanced through the rapid economic transformations since the early days of the regime change and managed by the elites that had the opportunities to utilize the existing resources. The second part of this presentation is about the referendum law, here in Albania, of course. The referendum is one of the most important instruments through which citizens can exercise their sovereignty directly. However, only 3 referendums have been held in Albania over the past 3 decades. Article 150 of the Constitution, of the Albanian Constitution, anticipates the adoption of a new law on referendums, but such a law is still missing. As of 2020, a draft law on referendums prepared by civil society organizations and sponsored by an MP has been deposited with the Parliamentary Committee on Legal Issues, which should encourage greater engagement. And another constitutional instrument for citizen participation here in Albania is the Citizens' Legislative Initiative. A second bullet and a point on these practices is the very last one, national consultation of Prime Minister office. According to the Prime Minister, this national consultation conducted for the first time here in Albania was put in order to give a voice or to give a say, to the ordinary citizens. And through the national consultation initiative, the Albanian government, according to the Prime Minister office, wants to give life to a popular assembly to hear the opinion of citizens on issues of strategic importance for the country that affect our economy, society, and future. Specifically, through a questionnaire that is reached the homes of every Albanian family, the government addresses to citizens some questions related to the current challenges of cross-sectoral development of the country, from the economy, justice, social protection, or our democratic coexistence. The given answers were analyzed and processed by the co-government team at the Prime Minister office, and then they were publicly presented to the Albanian citizens. According to the Prime Minister, citizens' responses are important for the government to understand their ideas and perceptions on the issues in question, while the initiative itself is an opportunity to consult with each other as citizens interested in the future of Albania. But let me say that when this national consultation in Albania were put forward, there had many contested elements and groups and individuals here and experts saying that first, the national consultation was not conducted in a very professional way. For instance, how you conduct a research poll or survey. And secondly, Albanian citizens were asked even about the Open Balkan initiative or the coupling with Republic of North Macedonia, whether we wouldn't have the pre-accession talks negotiations in June, etc. So in this national consultation were put issues and topics that, well, they are not in terms of citizens to have a power on decision making or to have a say on that, because issues like Open Balkan initiatives or other regional initiatives or the coupling with a Republic of North Macedonia when it comes at integration process, they are not issues that are handled or they can be handled by ordinary citizens or topics that are much more related to their everyday life. And then months ago—
I'm sorry, just a quick reminder, you have 2 more minutes. We must open the floor for discussion. So please, yeah.
Okay, yes, I will finish in 2 minutes. Yes.
Sorry for that.
Yeah, okay. And the last part is about the national poll that was as a social experiment conducted for the first time here in Albania by the Institute for Democracy and Mediation, a think tank here. And this workshop brought together a microcosm of Albania in the form of 110 ordinary citizens to deliberate on some of the most debated and most topical issues in public and political discourse in the country, such as parliamentary oversight, citizen participation in decision-making, internal party democracy, electoral reform, diaspora voting, climate change, and economic emigration. And what would be the key findings? And I will conclude here. Well, according to the social experiment, the first one conducted here in Albania, Albanians are not familiar with instruments of parliamentary oversight over the executive. When asked about their familiarity with parliamentary control and oversight of government, the majority of national survey respondents reported being a little to 35.7% or not at all to 20.4% familiar. Another 33% of respondents reported moderate familiarity with the oversight function of the parliament. The national survey found in a number of 1,196 respondents that most Albanians claim they are moderately or slightly interested in politics, while 15.8% are not at all interested. Only 10.8% of respondents reveal they are very interested and 2.2% extremely interested in politics. However, such plain disinterest is not reflected in voter turnout at parliamentary elections. This report's national survey data confirms the citizens' disillusion with politics in general. Albanians tend to disagree with the statement that MPs and politicians care a lot about what people like me think. And when asked how much do you trust the parliament to do what is right, the majority of respondents reported no trust to 40% of them, or little trust to 29.2%. Less than 1/3 of them had either a lot, a 6.7%, or a great deal, 1.3% of trust that parliament is doing what is right. So Albania lacks developed practice and academic research on deliberative democracy. So I think that more action and more think tanks and more conferences like this should enhance our participation in reaching a more detailed theoretical, practical, and practitioner level. So this is all about. Even though I had so few minutes, but it's okay.
Okay, thank you, Ines. Thank you very much. Now we have we will have shorter discussion that we planned because we move. I'm really sorry for this noise here. We will move back to the place we were before. We asked them to days before we asked them to stop, and they said they will, but this didn't happen. So I'm sorry once again. And yeah, let's start with the discussions. I think if somebody has something to add. Mladen. I will also kindly ask you to present yourselves when you're making questions, if this is okay.
Thank you for your contribution. My name is Mladen. I have a question for Anna. You mentioned that the success of the DD process in Participatory is due to the fact that the choosing model was in line with the local tradition. But the downside of that is that the process effectively reinforces the power structures and it's participatory effect. On the other hand, it seems that when the process is not in line with local traditions, it doesn't really work. So my question is there something in between? The other modalities which can actually have some participatory effect on the local tradition?
I think we should collect some more questions if there are any. Okay, let's start with that one and then we'll follow.
Well, thank you very much. I am I don't know. the short answer and the honest answer is I don't know which would be a good model to both what we say, you know, get roots in the community and exist and survive long term, and not reinforce the present power structure, as I said. I wasn't completely honest when I said that it reinforced the present power structure, because it has a potential to change it. Let me give you this example. The type of discussions that would probably be held or would take place outside of public view, between, you know, like circles of people interested in something to do with their community, now takes place in a more institutionalized and public view. So as far as I understood, like the same groups of people who are interested to do something for their little community would get together and talk about it, and then would go to the mayor and say, listen, we need a new street light in our little village. And then if the mayor, depending on the power of that, the voting power of that little village, they would get or they would not get any street light. And the participatory budgeting process kind of pushes everything in the public eye, and everybody has to make public arguments for what they are asking for. And the city has to also give public arguments for why aren't they giving something, or why aren't they doing something. So in the long run, this forcing the process into the public eye encourages, I hope, would encourage other people to join and come to these meetings and say what they think the needs of their communities are, and not let the same people direct the process. Another, yeah, that's what I think is a kind of hope that will happen. I don't have a very revolutionary idea. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you, Anna. I also, is there, yeah.
Very technical question for one lifetime, and
And the question is, definitely we have this something that we call democracy infrastructure and infrastructure in democracy, because I'm very interested in the topic.
No, we haven't. We did write a longer piece for the conference itself that has been circulated. So that is something where you can look at the literature that we're using and the references that we're using. And we might be publishing something on our website for sure. Because the point of, again, being research and practitioners is also to, and there's a lot of talking also in new institutions about this topic. So it's interesting for us to also influence that discourse.
It is high on our priority list to do some more writing and thinking about it.
Okay, if I can, but you also have questions.
Yes. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I was wondering, it's not a technical question, but it's your remark about the fact that in your country, it was like the Brazilian model or the Porto Alegre model. And so I already made some comments, but I was wondering why, because I don't see any assembly where delegates are elected. We already mentioned the fact that the budget is small, and the scope of the investment is also quite limited. So, to which extent exactly you think the comparison with Porto Alegre stands with what you see in your country?
Well, obviously not much. This is what how I found different descriptions of different PV models, and this one was closest to my experience, although not close enough, obviously. But the only thing that really is different in Pazin from other or closer to Porto Alegre and different from other consultative processes is this fact that the citizens really do decide on the money, on how to spend the money, you know. So there is no like, okay, we will propose and then we will wait. Maybe the city government will accept, maybe they will not accept. You know, whatever it is voted on, it is accepted. As I said, within the limits of what the municipal government can do. Like they cannot, you know, like build an airplane, obviously, you understand that. So, and I think it is a huge step forward in our, we were talking previously about the trust in politics and this political efficacy, or how was the term, that people don't trust that they can do anything in politics. And even though, as I said, it is very tiny, but it happens that you vote for something and then it materializes within a very definite amount of time. So I think it is very important, and it is a part of the success of this model. Not only the traditions and the way how the sub-local units are, you know, put on the top of what was previously a local community, and maybe probably like one of these old Yugoslav so-called miestni zajednici. Also, there were sub-local units in the previous system as well. So there is like a institutional continuity that I think also contributes.
Thank you, Anna. Any other questions? I have some. Okay. Olga.
Well, I have a question for Paolo and Paolo. So about this infrastructure structures. You mentioned, as far as I understood, the main elements of this infrastructure that you talked about are those hubs, places where people can come together, discuss, work on something together. That is the main point, as I understood. Correct me if I'm wrong. But then how do you make those spaces permanent if they depend on external funding? And perhaps the answer lies in the fact that the people that come together can relocate. It doesn't matter where they are. So this infrastructure is kind of moving around. So if they lose one space, they can move to another. Maybe this is also one possible solution to this kind of problem. I'm interested in your comment on this.
The hub we created was part of the networks that we see as essential for these infrastructure, and there might be, if we do some more thinking, might be other elements than the three we have now in the future. But in an ideal situation, there would be some more support in the beginning to set these things up, and there would be some minimal support for the long term. But we know that this isn't always the case, and it's not always the case in the work we do. But what we also try to do in the case that there isn't that long-term funding is when we have the money and when we have the funding, how can we design in a way that there is still some benefits from what we did, even after the funding is gone. And in the case of that hub, whenever that network is created, and if a city sees the value of working with that network, because it is better at addressing certain challenges, and it has knowledge of engagement strategies, but also has knowledge of key figures, and there are people who trust each other and work well and are willing to experiment, then if we or others have done our jobs right, or that's what we try to do, and we have worked on those skills and those capacity building, we hope that some of that can stay even after we or the funding is gone, because it is an added value and because it can address future challenges in a better and democratic way. So that is what we hope for, and that is part of what we intentionally try to do. But whether it always happens, especially when there isn't that minimal level of support for the long term, is also depending on some kind of willingness and maybe some kind of funding. But we try to design in that way that it isn't dependent on the funding or the resources itself, to at least have something that lasts beyond the initial project. That's kind of an answer.
Anna wants to, yeah, just turn on the microphone.
Okay, thank you, Fergal. I was at a conference, and somebody from France also had to talk about the models of participatory budgeting in France, and he said something very interesting, that in some cities or towns, it is kind of a, how to say, it has become a part of the identity of the people there. So like families get together and think of proposals, and it is a kind of very popular thing to do. I forgot the city that was in question. I will send it to you later. But did you in your research find any such developments? Because in Pazin, I did find some, it has gone for 10 years almost now, and they do, incorporate the process in their, self-understanding and identity. It's too much to say identity, but let's say if you go to Pazin and if you ask them, what do you know about participatory budgeting? Of course, they don't say that they know anything about it. Their project is called Pazin Proračun. And they know what it is. And they said, that we have this here, it goes on for ages and we're all committed to it or something like that. It's a good thing. Or even if they don't think it's a good thing, they will know and kind of know that their town is specific for that. And in France, it's not like that.
Well, I think the main difference, the main problem is what we can call a participant. In the French PB, I think most participants to me are not participants, they will just vote. And we need to look at the dynamics that could bring a person in front of a cell phone or a computer on the platform, and what do they know about the different proposals that are at stake and how they make their choice. For many people, for many cities, and the same for the department, basically they reach a platform because they see the information for a specific project and they will vote for that project without looking at the other proposals. That's something also you could see in Lisbon, for example, in other countries. When you don't have any meetings where you have a debate and a presentation of the different proposals, most participants take less than 1 minute. And what is funny in France that it's mainly provided by digital platforms, and they never provide the data about how long does it take to vote in France. When I did one research in the city in Grenoble, and the vote was physical, I think it still is, so there is no digital vote at all. People, when they enter the space, they look at different boards with the 30 different proposals, and they took between 15, 20 minutes before voting. Here you can have the time to make up your mind. So that's the point. The first point is how much does it take to vote before making your mind. You have participants that will make a real, the whole process of submitting, and I'm not aware of any families doing that. The families, what I saw in some cases, and also saw that in Portugal 10 years ago, is young people voting. When you ask them what kind of project you vote for, they go back to their parents and say, okay, they say the number of the project and what was the project about, and they go back to their parents and say, what was the project about? So basically, they are mimicking in many cases when it's done within a family. They are mimicking what the parent says. Is it a good thing for democracy? I'm not sure. So yeah, I don't believe in fairy tale. But I'm curious about the reference and how it's really observed.
Okay, thank you. I think we are on time. They really push us to go to finish on time. But if there's only one more, I have many questions, but I will pose it during the breaks. If somebody else wants to ask something, now is the time. No? Okay, thank you all very much. This was very interesting. We will continue our discussions during the break, lunch and coffee breaks, and during other panels. And yeah, thank you for joining us today.